Good morning, everybody. From Ferguson to Baltimore and from Minneapolis to Kenosha, this is Free Atlantic Radio, the voice of the Northeastern nation. I am your host, Tom Kaczynski. Want to welcome you to the Friday, August 28th version, although I'm recording right now, it's 5 a.m. because I can't sleep, on, August 27th. And a dirty little secret is I like to record the shows a day ahead of time now. Why? So that you can get them first thing in the morning and listen on your commutes or your jogs or whatever you have to do during the day or whenever you like. I want to say thank you to everyone who listens to the show and tell you can reach out to us at New Albion at protonmail.com. That's the email. The Twitter is at Atlantic_Nation. And also, we've put up a new Telegram group, so if anyone wants to communicate with other people throughout the Atlantic Nation, our current website is t.me/Atlantic Homeland. So, I also want to thank everyone who supports the program. It takes a lot of time and work to do this, and if I'm going to keep doing it, y'all have to help a little bit. At CVCPRV is the Venmo, and you can send support to P.O. Box 35, Greenville Junction, Maine, 04442. So, now that we've gone through that, today's show is going to be backwards day. We're going to do it opposite of how I usually like to do it. Usually I come on here, I give you a monologue where I lay out the whole case, and then I give you the facts to put it together. But given the sensitivity of the topic of which I'm going to discuss, I'm going to put the facts together going backwards in time to tell a story, and then you're going to get a little monologue at the end of this. And although I have every intention of returning to talking about digital currency, which is a very important issue, my suspicion is it's not going to be enacted over the weekend. So I am going to jump gears a little bit in a way that's highly relevant, and we're going to talk about Black Lives Matter. We are going to talk about the deeper foundations of it, and leaving aside whatever terrible events are happening in Kenosha or what's happening in Seattle or Portland or what will happen over this weekend, I want you to have a better background in understanding this, and it's directly related to everything we've talked about. Now, as just preview before we go into this, some of you will recall I had a pretty popular program in Coronavirus Central, and the minute I saw the George Floyd protests, I started transitioning to a new show. And why did I do that? Because I saw, as I often do, that this was going to become the big issue. Who's talking about COVID when the cities are burning due to, civil unrest that's been incited? And it has been incited, and it is not natural at all. But I knew this was going to be the issue because I've known and watched these things for years. Some of you may know I'm the author of The Coming Civil War, which is probably the best-selling book in a nonfiction basis on this subject specifically, and I'm sort of well known for predicting these things. So check that out if you haven't. That's another way you can help support the program and also educate yourself. Too few people have actually read the sequel to it, Incoming, which actually predicted that the far left was going to be used by the neoliberal elites. That's where we are now. But rather than laying out the whole story for you, let me just put this point, that we are seeing a controlled demolition of the United States. What started with COVID and the economic shutdown of small business and the centralization of all the power in one place, the currency things we've been talking about that's led to authoritarian outcomes in places as far-flung as Australia where they haven't had nearly the same problems, but we are seeing the same outcome. Remember that when you see the riots in the street, they are part of an effort to destroy and degrade America to a point where it could either be A, collapsed, or B, overtaken so that it can be part of a single global system, because right now the American system is, for lack of a better term, the core of the global system, and the globalists don't want it that way. They have a system update they're doing. But we're not going to go into that until the end. We'll get to that at the end of this thing. And what I want to do is I want to go work backwards in time and talk about George Floyd. We're going to talk about BLM, and we're going to talk about how something ended up happening as we look at curfews in Minneapolis and Wisconsin, in different areas, and that we see this being pushed all around this country. And what I would even say is a demoniacal effort to kind of destroy what's happening. So this piece was published on August 26, 2020. This is by KARE News, Channel 11. This is the NBC affiliate in Minneapolis, okay? Or Minneapolis, Minnesota. I apologize. Okay. New court documents say George Floyd had fatal level of fentanyl in his system. Defense attorneys argue drug overdose and pre-existing health conditions caused Floyd's death. And this was written by Lou Raguse. All right, Minneapolis. New documents filed in the George Floyd case give new information about the Hennepin County medical examiner's findings in Floyd's autopsy. Handwritten notes of a law enforcement interview with Dr. Andrew Baker, the Hennepin County medical examiner, said Floyd had 11 nanograms per milliliter of fentanyl in his system. Quote, if he were found dead at home alone and with no other apparent causes, this could be acceptable to call an OD. Deaths have been certified with levels of 3, Baker told investigators. So just to put that in clarity for you, George Floyd had quadruple the amount of fentanyl in his system required for a overdose, okay, that you could legally die, and it would be considered by the coroner, that's what the medical examiner is, that he had too much in his system, okay? In another new document, Baker said that is a fatal level of fentanyl under normal circumstances. But then Baker added, I'm not saying this killed him. And he didn't want to touch that, but let's just take this point here, that literally if they saw the evidence absent the video, it would be thought fentanyl was the cause of George Floyd's death and this was an overdose, okay? Defense attorneys for the officers have signaled they will argue Floyd died from the drugs and pre-existing health conditions. The new document said Floyd had a heavy heart and had one artery was at least 75% blocked. Dr. Stephen Nelson, chairman of Florida's Medical Examiners Commission, who is not affiliated with the case, reviewed the new files and said that doesn't mean the drugs or health condition is what caused Floyd's death. We've all had those kinds of cases where these levels come into play. You've got to look at the whole picture, Nelson said. It's one thing to die with something, it's another thing to die from something. Don't we know that from COVID, right? But the documents say Baker performed the autopsy before watching the videos of police restraining Floyd with Officer Derek Chauvin's knee on Floyd's neck because Baker wanted to avoid bias in his autopsy. In Baker's final report after watching the videos, he ruled Floyd's death a homicide caused by law enforcement's subdual, restraint, and neck compression. The FBI asked the Armed Forces medical examiner to review Baker's autopsy, and they agreed with his finding, writing his death was caused by the police subdual and restraint with cardiovascular disease and drug intoxication contributing. The next court case is hearing is scheduled for September 11th. Oh, them putting on September 11th, that's just wrong. It's like they're trying to do it, okay? So I'm just giving you evidence. So was it a good policy that they had? No, but it was the standard operating policy of the Minneapolis police. And what I'm saying to you is, let's leave aside the political BS of people covering their backsides in this. The bottom line is the guy had 4 times the amount you'd need to kill a person of fentanyl in his system, okay? Secondly, the guy also had heart problems. Thirdly, if you see the video long before Derek Chauvin lays a hand on him, and I'm not exonerating the officers, by the way, I don't approve of what they did, but I want you to be very clear. George Floyd screaming, I can't breathe, in the back of the car, too, and the criminal act, if there was any here, probably by the officers, was the failure to recognize a fentanyl overdose, which I'm a little surprised they weren't able to do, given the frequency with what that happens. But my point here is to show that this case is not a cut and dry case, and in fact, I suspect if there's a fair jury, George Floyd's officers will probably get off or get charged with a lesser charge than murder for sure, which will lead to more rioting and looting. And why does this happen? Because you get one side of a story that's put out by the media, and that even though every single person in the country, from President Trump on downward, across all sides agreed when watching the video that it was egregious and that this was something that should have happened, this was not used as an opportunity to look for justice. This was used as an opportunity to look for violence and anger, and that people were bussed in to go ahead and make things happen in the streets. And we've seen that. There has been report after report. You can look at all the local reports if you want, or you can take my word for it. Everywhere you see this violence, Minneapolis, Kenosha, all these places, people are being bussed in. I mean, you hear stories about actually Black Lives Matter advocates being sent from the big urban centers on the coast, Chicago, and on the West Coast, to places to cause trouble. Yet no one ever goes these things, and no one is ever booked in the system. Nothing ever happens, to the point where we had the tragic deaths that happened yesterday, would have been 2 days ago in Kenosha, and who knows what will have happened between the time you hear this. But let's say all this could have been prevented by putting the body cam out there, because the police had the body cam, and they had all this evidence that went ahead and painted a very different view of what happened with the George Floyd death. That ultimately you can see that there was a whole sequence of events that happened, and you see this happen over and over again. A 20-second sound clip is put out there, media clip I should say, is put out by the media, and they go ahead and they tell you, riot, go forward, and why the media keeps doing this. So let's look at this. This is from Legal Newsline. This piece was published on August 7th, 2020. We're going to work our way backwards. Leaked body cam video of George Floyd sets off investigation and raises questions. Minneapolis. The British tabloid The Daily Mail has disclosed partial body cam video of George Floyd's arrest by Minneapolis police officers on May 25th, setting off an investigation into the leaked footage, as well as raising questions about Floyd's cause of death and why the state hasn't willingly released the footage. The Associated Press reported on August 3rd that the release of the videos, 10 minutes from former Officer Thomas Lane's body cam and 18 minutes from former Officer J. Alexander Kung's body cam, has been characterized as an unauthorized leak and is being investigated in a Minnesota court. And you can go back, the link is in here, you can look at it, and what you would see is that this is a very different story that was told. You had a degree of belligerence, you had a person having problem long beforehand, you have a narrative that looks different if you have the full evidence of it, and you deserve to have the full evidence before you tear the whole country down. Alright? In an August 4th tweet on Twitter, the Columbia Bugle accused Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison of hiding the videos, while the Daily Wire's Matt Walsh reported that the video leak reveals the story of George Floyd's death is, quote, far more complicated than the media led us to believe. And an August 6th report by the American Spectator asserts that the physical, scientific, and electronically recorded evidence in the case overwhelmingly and conclusively proves that police are not guilty of the charges they face. Officer Derek Chauvin, seen on cell phone video pressing his knee into Floyd's neck as Floyd lay on the ground, is charged with second-degree murder, and former officers Lane King and Tao Thao are charged with aiding and abetting that murder. The evidence proves that when he first encountered the police, Floyd was well on his way to dying from a self-administered drug overdose, wrote George Perry for The Spectator. And this fits what would have fit the evidence that the medical examiner put out there. Now, the medical examiner doesn't want to make a political statement because he's elected probably to serve in a Democratic county by Democratic people. That's Hennepin County, or appointed. I don't know how it works over there. But he's not going to put himself in the sling. But the evidence is the evidence. You make judgments. If you went ahead and you drank 6 bottles of whiskey, do you think you would survive? That's probably about the equivalent, right? All right. Ellison did not immediately respond to a request for comment, but his spokesperson previously told Legal Newsline that July 2nd the footage was being withheld because the case was still under investigation. Right, he wanted to fight it in the court of public opinion. The body camera footage is evidence in the investigation along with many other kinds of evidence, said John Stiles, Deputy Chief of Staff with the Office of Minnesota Attorney General. There is no current timeline for releasing it. In an interview with Washington Post, Ellison said he is a firm believer in transparency and the public's right to know, but in explaining his refusal to release the body cam video, he said that a higher priority is a successful prosecution. So, and let's take him at his words, right? What he said is it's more important to prosecute people who he wants to go after than seeing the evidence get out that proves that it's innocent or guilty, or that could have prevented nationwide riots, okay? Just want you to be clear about this. Former prosecutor Bilal A. Isaili says the footage release should be all or nothing before trial. And this was done on purpose, by the way. They didn't want it out there because this was useful. What happens? The old Rahm Emanuel quote. Never take, always take advantage of a crisis. This is what you want to do. So let's talk. Who is Keith Ellison? And this piece is by TRT World, which is actually, as best as I understand this is a publication talking about black issues and Muslim issues. This is something that is in support of these things, but I want to see this. This was written by Saad Hassan, okay, so someone who's going to be friendly to him, on the 4th of June, 2020. Who is Keith Ellison, the black Muslim leading the Floyd prosecution? Just wanted to give you some background on who our prosecutor is. And he was also running to be the chair of the Democratic Party, okay? So this is a guy with a lot of clout. He didn't come from nowhere. He's been around for a while. He's, been in the House. Someone who's been around, okay? Before he was a top state prosecutor and the first Muslim to be elected to Congress, he was a student who fought for the rights of black people. In 1989, Keith Ellison, as a college student, was part of a campaign seeking justice for an elderly black couple which was killed in a botched-up police raid. He helped organize rallies and spoke at press conferences to pressure the then Minnesota Attorney General to investigate the police officers who threw the stun grenade in an apartment while young black people pinned to the ground outside shouted there were old people inside. No police officer was ever charged for that incident. So he came up hostile to the police, and now he's in charge of the Attorney General, right? The prosecutor who takes the jobs of police is literally a guy whose formative experience is in hating cops, okay? And I'm not saying, I don't know the details of this case, maybe as an issue, but I want you to understand the prejudices and biases. Now he's Minnesota's Attorney General and responsible for prosecuting the policeman charged with killing George Floyd, an African-American man, last month. As the top lawyer in the state, he's in the spotlight as the United States has been roiled by protests against police brutality targeted at the black community. And remember, when we're talking about this, they did a lot of studies on this. They were saying there were, I think up till the time this had happened, there were a total of 10 incidences where there was white officer violence against black police that ended up in a fatality, and I think 5 of them were clear incidents where the officer was in a shoot or be killed situation. So very small number of things, but this is presented as an epidemic. Why? Because the media has an agenda. Let's continue. The trial can be a challenge for Ellison, 56, who is detested by the right wing for being too liberal and looked up to his own supporters as someone who can deliver justice. Over the years, his identity has shifted. In high school, he was part of a band called the Deviants. In university, he defended the Nation of Islam's charismatic but controversial leader, Louis Farrakhan. Ellison was always involved in social experiences since his college days. In 1984, while pursuing a bachelor's degree at Wayne State University, he wrote an article on Bernard Goetz, the white vigilante who shot and wounded 4 African-American men on a New York subway train that same year. In the article, he questioned the widespread sympathy for the shooter. Well, I'll tell you, because black men under 25 years old are all thieves, hoodlums, and dope dealers in the eyes of the general public. Later in the article, which was published in a university paper, he said, and when the general public and media condone the shooting for 4 young black men based on a paranoid man's fear, it won't be long before police officers, old ladies, weekend survival gamers, and everyone else considers it open season on the brothers. Around that time, he converted to Islam and started attending a mosque. So this is a man who was motivated by the idea of issues related to criminal justice, which is fine, and he decided to become a Muslim and a black nationalist because of this. So I want you to understand his motives and what he's done with his life, because you deserve to know this. This is the person who decided not to release the body cam that went ahead and led to the sequence of events that has destroyed many, many businesses and made, basically is leading us further down the golden path to a civil war. Okay, let's continue. After enrolling at the University of Minnesota Law School, his political beliefs really started to take shape. You notice how they go ahead and erase the foundational stuff? He is known to have taken up the cause of black nationalism during those years when heading the Black Law Student Association. So this is a guy who's been deep in identity politics for 30, 40 years. In an interview at the time, speaking about the black couple which was killed in a police raid, he said, if you think that just getting some African-American people on the police force is going to change it, you deny the fact this is a systemic problem and not random, individualized cowboyism on behalf of the police. The police force is designed to suppress the communities of color and working-class European communities, okay? So he's talking, so you hear this, when he talks to suppress the communities of color and working-class European communities. What this is communist speak for class warfare, okay? And he's doing it from both an Islamic perspective, a black perspective, and a communist perspective. And you can hear the way, there are certain ways you phrase certain things. Working class European communities, that's a very clear communist way who would never say the word white, because whiteness is bad. Remember, fragility there. And who will go ahead and attack this idea. And so he thinks the police force systemically is a problem. And what does he do to take charge of that? He's like, well, if you can't beat the police, you can let off every criminal, if you think about it. And that's what's happened. That's why when you look at all these prosecutors and why the Open Society Foundation, George Soros, paid literally more than we have seen in any amount of time in the last few years. So if we look at this and we continue working our way forward, that he was trying to change the system. How do you change the system? Well, you ignore the laws, you stop enforcing them, and you enforce what you believe. In 1990, he helped launch the newsletter, the Coalition for Police Accountability, which reported on police abuse. The call to politics. After university, Ellison worked for a few years for a nonprofit that provided legal aid to minority communities, including African Americans. He later practiced law as a criminal defense lawyer. Propelled by his activism, he ran for the seat of Minnesota's 5th Congressional District in the House of Representatives and won in 2006, becoming the first Muslim to enter Congress. Ellison, a Democrat, is credited for several popular legislations during his time as a lawmaker, which ran until 2019, including provisions to protect credit card holders from abusive practices. While his activism has helped add to his popularity, it has also been used by his opponents to smear him. In 2016, during his bid for the Democratic National Committee chair, his articles from his university years, when he used the name Keith E. Hakeem, started to do the rounds. One of the articles was in defense of Farrakhan, the leader of the Nation of Islam, who was accused of making anti-Semitic remarks. Ellison had indeed been part of a group which helped to organize the Nation of Islam rallies, but he had parted ways from the organizations years ago, citing the lack of direction in the leadership. He's uneasy about his past associations. He canceled the New York Times interview when he was told it would include questions about Farrakhan. The Nation of Islam has called him a hypocrite. A new fight. Last January, Ellison was sworn in as the Minnesota Attorney General. The Minnesota's 5th Congressional District continues to keep its pace as one of the most liberal constituencies in the U.S., his successor being Ilhan Omar. But another controversy became ammunition for Ellison's Republican opponents and bogged him down during his bid for the Attorney General's office when his ex-girlfriend accused him of mistreating her. As the top public lawyer in Minnesota, Ellison has challenged President Donald Trump's anti-immigrant stance and has taken up causes which would have likely been ignored by others. The Star Tribune, that's Minneapolis' paper, wrote in December that Ellison was one of the most activist attorney generals in Minnesota in decades, shuffling between tasks such as a lawsuit against a vaping company, Juul Labs, and hearing about deadly police encounters in community meetings. So this was a guy who was looking for an opportunity, just so you understand this. His detractors, like Republican Doug Wardlow, who Ellison defeated in the Minnesota Attorney General, accused him of being a lawyer of far-left special interest. In response, Ellison said, "People elected me. They know they have politics. They're going to influence it. But that's different from me discharging my responsibility to defend the state." Well, now, this was printed in June, and if we go back and we look at what he did, what did he do? You're going to have to make a judgment, because I'm going to lay out a case for you. I am going to serve as the prosecutor about the fact that this is a political action that was deliberately released out there. And I want to give you a little bit of evidence on this, too. And we'll pick the bugaboo. Everyone loves talking about George Soros. But this was interesting. I want you to hear about this. So, I'm going to use Ballotpedia, which is a neutral, unbiased site, and I just want you to understand here that what we have seen here is different. And I'm going to skip to local political activity. We always talk about the national level stuff, but let's get local. This is talking about George Soros on Ballotpedia. I'm just reading this, and you can look it up yourself, challenge it if you want, and you can chase the money, because what do we believe? We believe at Free Atlantic Radio that people believe what they've usually believed absent some major change, and we don't see that in Keith Ellison's case. And we believe that if you look at where money flows, you can understand what's really happening in a system, okay? So, in addition to his national political contributions and support, George Soros has also been active in regional politics at the state and local levels. Politico describes Soros's local involvement as working through, quote, a network of state-level super PACs, the National 527 Unlimited Money Group. In many states, the political committees are called Safety and Justice PACs, with the state name preceding to the committee name, such as the Arizona Safety and Justice PAC. These committees receive most, if not all, of their funding from Soros, according to Politico. During the 2015 and 2016 election cycles, Soros supported a series of candidates, the bulk of which were running for the office of district attorney. Soros's activity, according to Politico, has been aimed at, quote, reshaping the American justice system. So I want you to understand, this is not new. This is something that was through, and you can read through here that he talks about the Philadelphia district attorney primary race, Arizona Safety and Justice, Colorado, Florida, Illinois, Mississippi, Missouri, New Mexico, Texas, Louisiana, and perfect example here, it's talking about Kim Gardner, actually, overwhelmingly funded by George Soros. Okay, we could go through and you look at all these if you want to, but why did I take this little detour? Well, if you can't go ahead and have people give you the laws you want, you can get in charge of the laws that exist by using your money and not enforce any of them. So what you've seen in Portland, what you've seen in Seattle, what you've seen in Minneapolis, what you've seen in all of these places is something that is deliberate, ongoing, and recurring. And what I'm doing, just so you know, I'm putting together a case. I'm using all public sources so you can go trace them and you can see what's happening. And why would you be having someone who's very clearly political buying district attorney offices? Well, maybe because you knew you had something bigger in plan. And remember, this is the same people, George Soros, who was involved with color revolutions, where they found ways to destabilize societies. This happened in Georgia, it happened in Ukraine, it happened in Egypt. You can go read the history of it if you're curious about it, and I recommend that you do. But this is the same sort of thing in the U.S. So, spontaneous, peaceful protest to George Floyd's death? Maybe. or the deliberate creation of a effort to destabilize. Because remember, Black Lives Matter, which is what has been the vehicle for most of this, was something that was tried in 2015, and it ultimately ended up having a lot of problems in 2016 because in Dallas, Texas, there ended up being a shooting where a couple officers got shot. It turned people against it. The funding disappeared. Black Lives Matter was never heard from. And Donald Trump became president, which was the opposite of what I believe the deep state wanted at that time. Now, at this point, I actually think, ironically, I actually genuinely believe the powers that be want Trump to win, and I'll go into that more in detail later, but my thought on it is that honestly, they can deliver much more radical change in the streets right now with what they're being able to get away with than they could if a Democrat was in office. And that's the reality of it. And the levers of power are such that, remember, this is a global game we're talking about. And America might be the queen of the board, but she's not the king. The king is the UN. The king is whoever can run the thing. The king is the banking system. And so as you look at all these things and you begin to understand the game that's afoot, what you see is that America can be destroyed, and let's put it this way, the black queen can be sacrificed if that's what's needed out to take the white king, right? That's how it will end up going. And of course, that's a fair play in chess. And it's the same thing in politics. If you're playing on a global stage, then America's just one piece on the board. And unfortunately, the people we're dealing with who are putting money in, by the way, you want to talk about one of the corrupt things in the United States, how these people can keep dumping unlimited slush money in there. Well, the reason they get away with it is their patrons, ultimately, when you go back to it, are the people who actually run the banks. And they're the ones who can print money unlimited. And if you don't believe that, who's funding Black Lives Matter? Well, it's the corporations. Who's funding the corporations? Well, it's the Federal Reserve. And you can see this because you can chase every piece of this backwards. That the Federal Reserve prints the money at the behest of Congress because it is a cyclical relationship. And they say, okay, we're going to pay for your corporate bonds. The corporate bonds are released and they pay for the stock, even though the small businesses have to go wander into PPP. And that's why huge swaths of the small business class of America have been broken and destroyed, and they can't come back. They don't have the resources, and there isn't resources to give them, so that's gone. What we've done is destroyed the tax base. We've Cloward Pivened it, and Cloward Piven's just one. What it is it's a theory that goes something like this, that you make the expense of running the state so high that literally you want to make the state bigger. So you make social welfare systems have to be everything. And this is one of the weird ironies of communist thought, that you literally can make the system worse and worse, and you get more and more control until it absolutely breaks. And that's why when you see things get worse all the time, when you begin to recognize we are dealing with a neo-Bolshevik revolution in the United States, you know what's going to happen. Things are going to get worse because as the government screws more up, people will ask the government to do more. And that ends up being difficult. And then you usually historically end up with a choice where one of three things happens. Either you have a Bolshevik revolution take charge, and you can read the history of the Soviet Union. You have a neo-reactionary response that may be fascistic in nature, because ultimately you're still stuck with a socialist outcome. And then you go down the fascism route, and you can read about what that entails. Or you have the whole thing break apart into various subsegments. And I would argue in the American case that third situation is most likely, and that's why you're listening to Free Atlantic Radio, because here in the heart of empire, where things have not quite fallen apart, there's still some learned people who can tell you the people in charge are the people breaking this. It's not the kids on the streets who don't know any better, who've been indoctrinated every day of their lives. It's been the people at the top who know precisely what they're doing, precisely why they're doing it, and want this outcome. Remember, there are a lot less coincidences than you seem. You just have to find the bits and pieces. But we talked a little bit about Black Lives Matter, and I'm going to go back to the beginning before things start getting too crazy, and I'm going to grab a piece by Breitbart, and I know that'll be controversial for some people, but this is from John Hayward, who does good work on June 11th, and there's a lot of other links to sources you might like, but I want you to hear, and this has a lot of comments in their own words about the complex funding and ideology of Black Lives Matter, and as you listen to what they say about themselves, and I think it's completely fair to go ahead and indict people based upon their own self-evaluation, what they got money from, what they invested in, what causes they fight, what causes they support, and not just the political propaganda. You can't say anything because black is good, right? No one's disputing that Black Lives Matter. What we're disputing is what this organization that's propagandizing is doing, okay? So let's continue. All right, political and corporate support for Black Lives Matter has become ubiquitous over the past week. Everyone's email inbox is bulging with messages of support from corporate sponsors. Every website is covered with Black Lives Matter logos, the angry fist you see up there, which, by the way, is a socialist symbol. And the group has benefited from numerous fundraisers and charity sales. But many people might not realize that Black Lives Matter is a distinct political organization, not just a slogan or social media hashtag, and it has both enormous funding and a wide-ranging political agenda. BLM describes its own founders as three radical black organizers named Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi, who created a black-centered political will and movement-building project in response to the acquittal of Trayvon Martin's murderer, George Zimmerman. BLM's history page proudly salutes radical causes built into its DNA since 2013 founding, including liberation politics and transgenderism. So to give you a feel what liberation politics is, just so you know, it's like, imagine what happened in Haiti, where they basically slaughtered all the people who ran the plantations. Liberation politics tends to look a lot like that. It's like South Africa, where you go ahead and roll people of the former dominant class, you light them in fire and send them down the hill on tires. That's what liberation politics leads to. If you don't believe me, go watch. Be careful, the videos are graphic. In fact, BLM thinks other black civil rights movements aren't nearly radical enough, especially when it comes to the gender politics of the hard left. Black liberation movements in this country have created room, space, and leadership mostly for black, heterosexual, cisgender men. And that's how they say hetero. Leaving women, queer, and transgender people and others either out of the movement or in the background to work forward with little or no recognition. So, in the realm of identity politics, Tucker Carlson makes one really good point. This is class warfare. And what it is it's cultural class warfare on the Gramsci model, which is that you pick cultural groups that are disaffected, right? And they always do this. Roosevelt did this with poor people in the South. Franklin Roosevelt, that is. You pick the groups who are unhappy and you use them as the lever by which you create public anger, looking for a popular cause to go ahead and destabilize the regime. Because remember, revolutionary movements have one goal. They have to break the existing system, have a revolution, and take over. So when they go forward supporting whatever group they support, and they support a lot of groups that don't work. On the one hand, they support gay identity. On the other hand, they support the Muslims who, if they're Orthodox, will go ahead and throw them off a building. Why do they do this? Because it's not about how useful they are. One is a scimitar, right? And one is a sickle. But both are weapons that can be stabbed into the heart of America. And this is what you see. This is literally how liberation theologies and communist ideologies work. And you can go read that. We used to do bad words on the show, but life's depressing enough. I don't want to have to read you a quote from Chairman Mao every day to point out how this is communist. You already understand it. You wouldn't be listening to this show if you weren't a smart audience. You either get educated or you can't keep up, and I respect that about each and every one of you. But that is what you see, why you see these movements that would otherwise be very unpopular supported. And the other reason is they need to disconnect truth from reality. Why do they do that? Why do they say boys or girls even when they have their bits and pieces missing? They do it because they don't want you questioning them. They just want you giving a moral authority over to them in a secular state. And they'll have a religion of science at some point, or scientism, but it won't be science as a process. It will be settled science, like climate change agendas you saw. But that didn't prove as popular, whereas this, they have walked right into into the cutting of how you would have white guilt that has been fostered over years and years and years, and a friendly media go ahead and say that, well, if you're black, you can destroy everything and anything, and everyone will say it's not your fault. And I will say, in the end, I very much believe this before we get into this, that I sadly believe that black people are being set up for a huge fall, because eventually there will be a reaction, and whether the communists take power under a Stalinist regime, or if you actually see a right-wing reaction under Trump or some other figure, what will happen inevitably is the blacks who were out there, or the people who were blamed for this, are going to end up getting the worst of it, because it always happens that way. You always have the Bolsheviks purge the Mensheviks. And in the same sort of way, once they have power, which is their actual goal, the people who got them there will not be helpful. And look at how, if you want proof of this, I'll give you a perfect example. Look at how during the COVID crisis we treated old people who were sick. Cuomo puts them in nursing homes with one another so they can get sick and die. That was done, and it happened in other states. It happened in New Jersey. It happened in New York. And why did it happen? Because you're dealing with people who are socialists, and they believe in Fabian socialism. If you're not contributing, you have nothing to offer. So what will happen is all these people who think they're going to get all these benefits who are going to cause a revolution, they will be the first ones who get purged when it is all done, beyond the sort of people who can offer resistance to this. Why? Because what the government really wants, and what any revolutionary wants, is quiet people working who will give support, and people who are disloyal to one state will be disloyal to another. This is the way history really works, and if you don't believe me, go read the history of the Soviet Union in the 1920s, or look how Hitler purged his own SA, Ernst Röhm and all those people. This is a very common feature of authoritarian dictatorships, and it's something that happens over and over again until authority and power is established, which often lasts for one ruler. So whether it's Stalin, or whether it's Franco, or Pinochet, or Pol Pot, or pick your group, you end up in the same sort of background, and this is the history of how totalitarian regimes work. And unfortunately, we end up in that place in most of these outcomes, which is one of the reasons why, incidentally, I do Free Atlantic Radio, because there's a very small window for some of us to get out of this. I don't think all of us can, and I think we're going to walk straight into this set of problems. But let's talk back about BLM. I'm not going to give you all the details now, although I will interject more during this long article. But I want you to know what they believe in their own words, because there are a lot of quotes in here, and you deserve to know what it is that's really driving this. BLM incessantly refers to the deaths of Trayvon Martin, Mike Brown, and others as murder, ignoring all court decisions to the contrary, and describes police work as state-sanctioned violence against oppressed populations. In the course of explaining how it was formed, the group refers to cities like Ferguson, Missouri as occupied territory, with the law enforcement cast as a brutal invading force, and insists most other cities should be seen the same way. We understood Ferguson was not an aberration, but in fact a clear point of reference for what is happening to black communities everywhere. Corporation and foundation sponsors appear unconcerned that BLM is unclear about who runs the movement today and commands its vast resources. So where is this like? This is just like Antifa. You have these networks of people that are quote-unquote leaderless that are an insurgency, right? And why is it that way? Because then you can't target them. The group itself claims it has no top-level leadership at all. The project is now a member-led global network of more than 40 chapters. Our members organize and build local power to intervene in violence inflicted on black communities by the state vigilantes. You know what's another group that's like that? The Federal Reserve Bank. It's a series of banks owned by a series of private donors that no one is allowed to know who they are. It's just something that exists. You notice the similarities? I just want you to understand this. The BLM founders are involved in a sprawling network of other left-wing groups and clearly remain influential with Black Lives Matter, although they're not held accountable as its executives. A New Yorker interview with Tometi on June 3rd, for example, treated her as a top BLM spokeswoman while noting she has moved on to create and manage other organizations, most recently including an immigration activist group called the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, which is listed as a partner by Black Lives Matter. Another partner is the UndocuBlack Network, a multi-generational network of currently and formerly undocumented black people. Or basically, so let's say what this is. This is bringing in illegal immigrants, right? So this is the whole POC thing. We have been fighting and advocating to stop a war on black lives, and that is how we see it. This is a war on black life. Although I should say more violence happens, and you all know this, between blacks and other groups, but outside of that, if you want to talk about race warfare that actually happens in the cities, largely between blacks and Latinos over gang fighting. And what has ended up happening in this is the Black Lives Matter people is bringing in undocumented people, which leads to more violence. So it's not really against violence. What's it about? Violence is a means to an end. And look, let me give credit to the far left on this one. They understand that violence is the means by which history changes, the imposition of will on people who would not otherwise fight. They are doing it, and they are acting on it, and they are not going to step back. They can't afford to, because they know if they stop, they will be enemies of the state. So this will not get smaller. People understand that this system is filled with all sorts of inequality and injustice, and that implicit bias and just outright racism is embedded in the way that policing is done in this nation. When you think about it historically, it was founded as a slave patrol. The evolution of policing was rooted in that, Tometi said in her New Yorker interview. So this is what the people think of as the police, by the way. So this isn't about justice. This is about the fact that they see them as a system of oppression. They see these people, unironically, as the SS marking in the streets. So if you are a police officer us are listening to this, and I will tell you, we have a lot of sheepdogs out there who listen to Free Atlantic Radio. You guys have to do something to save this nation, and what you have to do is simply do one of two things. Do not enforce orders that do not make sense from your leadership. Enforce orders that should be, and if you have to all walk away together and make clear what these threats are and that you are not responsible for this, because you run guilty the potential of being the Eichmann defense in this whole thing where you are being used and manipulated. We understand that law enforcement is a hard job, and a lot of us get cranky about some of the work that gets done for obvious reasons because laws are often stupid. However, the fact is people do need security. You are appreciated, and most Americans understand and want that. President Trump's impending victory that's going to come will be specifically on that issue if we even get that far. However, you guys will need to take the lead in defending the areas that need to be defended, and when these things burn, let them have the consequences of their own outcomes. Do not sit yourself halfway between, and I understand that that's hard, but you know what? People won't blame you for the things you don't do. Let them have what they want. This is what they do, and I know that's going to sound strange to you, but it really is the case, and defend the people who need defending. Because ultimately, something has to happen, or you will all be in the same line with us weird radicals and reactionaries that are out here. Okay. In her interview with the New Yorker, Tometi said the coronavirus pandemic is yesterday's news, and the disease, which is said to be far more dangerous to blacks than any other demographic in the United States, should be no obstacle to righteous activism. Translation, lives don't matter. Black lives don't matter if the revolution is here, okay? These people have always acted this way. They acted that way under Robespierre. They acted that way under Lenin. They're going to act this way under whomever comes to the front. Concern about the pandemic is high, but people are also very clear that you can sit at home and also be affected by this illness, or you can go out and fight for a chance to live a life full of dignity. And remember that at the same time, if you and I went to church and we would go ahead and be said we're causing COVID to spread, these people were rioting in huge raucous numbers, and did they care? No, they said, no, that's okay. Even doctors went out there and they basically tightened the screws on them. And I want you to see, and one thing you need to know in all this, is the media is lying to you in an insane amount. When this all settles out, if there is a just outcome, people who were in the media should be held to account for their words, for the things they said, because blood is on their hands, and it's starting to go by the gallons at this point. All right. People could be also affected by the illness, or you can go out and fight for a chance to have a life full of dignity, and they are willing to risk it. I think we have to sit with the profundity of this moment and what it really means for people to say, you know what, we are in this health crisis, yet I cannot stay in my house. There's too much at stake. I'm going to make an informed decision, and I'm going out against all odds because it is worth it and the status quo is intolerable. Media puts out a hero complex. People are bored. State is providing income so people don't have to work. They can't work. Perfect mixture of events that's put forward so that you can have this sort of rioting. This has become a common sentiment on the left. Infections and deaths that could result from mass protests are less important than the BLM cause. BLM actually has a section about coronavirus on its website and makes absolutely no mention of lockdowns, social distancing, or any of the other draconian measures that have been imposed on the American people since March, including by some of these governors that look the other way. But you look at people like in Michigan and in Minnesota, where they said, no, we're not going to accept this if people want to gather, except when they riot. Then we're not even going to prosecute them because, Black Lives Matter. Instead, BLM quite accurately predicted the pandemic could result in massive social, economic, and political upheaval as systems reach crisis points and begin to fracture. And who told you that? I told you that in February on Coronavirus Central. Go back and check me. That's why you're listening, because I knew this thing was falling apart, and it's not just being falling apart, it's being driven apart. This was when it became clear to me this was no accident. This was a deliberate outcome when this program started behind Floyd, because I know what to look for. I spent a lot of years working in politics, and I can recognize NGO actions in a second, and you can too at this point. It's obvious, but this show is to lay background so that you understand what we're really dealing with before I can explain what comes next. This is BLM's 6-point strategy for dealing with the coronavirus. Immediately pass a coronavirus relief package that provides emergency funding assistance to cover expenses to massively test the population in the millions and provide emergency food and shelter for the homeless and poor. Provide a protection and testing plan for incarcerated people while in custody and upon release, and that actually expanded to releasing the prisoners, right? Expand SNAP, SNAP, and unemployment for the duration of the pandemic, that's food stamps. Immediately legislate fully paid sick leave for all workers. Implement an immediate moratorium on evictions and utility shutoffs. Emergency funding for family and community-based child care for families who cannot work from home. So basically, they wanted to have communism put in. Well, and then some of these measures made a lot of sense with respect to what happened with COVID, but the fact that COVID is a problem that creates a solution, is not something should be lost, because this is a man-made disease that emerged in China. Was it built there? Was it built in the U.S.? Does it matter? Ultimately, this was a solution that made authoritarian centralized solutions inevitable worldwide, and that is the virtue of it. It's bad enough to cause the problems to have the solutions you want without breaking that which you want to inherit. It's really clever, right? It's almost like a little scam. SNAP is better known as the food stamp program. None of these measures has anything to do with disease prevention or restarting the economy after the lockdown. It would become vastly more expensive if the massive BLM protests produce another wave of coronavirus infections or deaths, followed by another lockdown order. Right? That's coming, by the way. You can already see the hints of the lockdown order. The UK is starting to look at theirs going forward, and we will see that in the United States in September after kids go to school. I guarantee it. The first positive COVID test for people who participate in the protests and riots are beginning to come in. BLM funding. As the Washington Times noted in 2016, BLM presents itself as a plucky street-level movement with shoestring resources, but in truth it receives millions of dollars from corporate and political sponsors. The movement's funding gives a hint of how far its political agenda stretches beyond criticizing excessive use of force by police officers. Fortune also looked at BLM funding in 2016 and noted its agenda and funding streams could help dispel the myth that the movement itself is set on violence, but could also confirm the worst fears of skeptics who saw BLM becoming another part of the vast and protean left-wing money machine. The machinery of BLM funding has only grown more complex since 2016, exacerbating a problem skeptics have warned about from the start. It's very difficult to know what each dollar donated to the movement will actually be used for. But BLM's major financial supporters include, and let's just go through all these, Airbnb, $500,000. Anastasia, $1 million pledge. Bad Robot Productions, $10 million pledge. BTS, $1 million. Cisco, $5 million. DCM Cosmetics, $100,000. Democracy Alliance added BLM to its $500 million donor list. DoorDash, $500,000. Ford Foundation, $100 million donor fund. George Soros' Open Society Foundation, $33 million. And let me just tell you, $33 million, okay, if you don't know this, is an occult number in Masonry that goes to this idea of where you find certain ley lines on the planet. And basically, it's their way of saying, whenever you see 33 start popping up all over the place, it's a tip-off that you see occultists throwing money at this. Just, do your own research if you're curious about it, or go read someone like Manly P. Hall or Albert Pike. You'll learn a lot. In fact, go read Albert Pike, Morals and Dogma, and you'll look at America a different way. Glossier Cosmetics, $500,000. The Pokemon Company, $100,000. Scopely, $1 million. Let's see, Spanx, $100,000. Square Enix, $250,000. Ubisoft, $100,000. And these are video game manufacturers. The Weeknd, $250,000. Sources include the above-mentioned Washington Times and Fortune pieces, Politico, Rolling Stone, Forbes, NBC News, The Rapid L, which has a long list of fashion and cosmetic firms making donations to BLM. ArtNet on Monday published a list of artists and galleries holding charity sales to support BLM. The LA Times on Tuesday reported numerous companies are implementing donor match programs that will match individual donations to Black Lives Matter with corporate funds. And to be clear, the people who are actually taking the funds on the website, and I told you this, are Act Blue, and Act Blue's single biggest group that they give to is Joe Biden. So if you think there's any separation between the Democratic Party and what's happening here, there isn't. And if you want to question that, look what happened during the events of the Democratic National Convention. Not one word was mentioned about this. Now, I'm not here to tell you Republicans aren't corrupt in their own ways. Obviously, they are, and they're bought by different causes. But ultimately, these people who are on the far left, the Sanders Coalition, AOC, all those sort of people, they are fine with this. They like it. They see this is the opportunity for the revolution. And if you don't believe that, go read their own things, because they have a million groups. They're allowed to have them. Go read the GoFundMes they have for that are out there, that they're allowed to proliferate all throughout social media. Whereas if you want to read an alternative thing, you got this show and maybe 5 others, and who knows when I'm going to get shut down, As several of the above sources pointed out, it's not always easy to tell when donations are going to BLM itself or its partners. And that's not a flaw, that's a feature. This is what dark money looks like. There are literally now tens of millions, perhaps hundreds of millions floating around in all these activist groups that are being put around, and you want to know why they can keep having these protests go, how they can afford to have people out there in Portland every night for over 100 nights, how you're moving buses around. This is the money. The corporations are giving the money to the people who are going out there, that are going ahead and keeping the people distracted while they're robbing us blind, destroying their small business alternatives, and creating an authoritarian state that will go ahead and create the taxes that they need to pay for the money they got for free. You see, this is how fascism actually used to be understood. That it was a relationship where the state was publicly owned and that they worked with privately owned businesses and corporation. This is what it is, and it looks a lot like the state capitalism practiced by China. It's almost as if all these global efforts, the Chinese state capitalism and American corporatism, are merging into one system. And this is what you need to see. This is how it's actually being put together. And why is it happening? Because people who want to oppose it would be oppressed by the state, right? So it's no different. The FBI does not functionally behave much differently than the Chinese secret police at this point, and the American media is just as biased, just with a lot more voices than you would have, Pravda be in a Soviet state. So I want you to understand that we are seeing a synthesis, a convergence of communism and capitalism. Yuri Bezmenov talked about this, or if you don't believe that, go read the 1991 meeting. I think it was, or maybe it was 1990, in Malta between George Bush, the elder, and Mikhail Gorbachev, where they said, we need to try to merge our systems. And they've been doing it. And when did this all go crazy? When did you start hearing about all these problems? When did social justice become an issue? The moment the Cold War ended. It didn't end. Both sides decided to take the war against the people, and America signed on for it. And if you don't believe that, just look at some of the things that George Bush said in his own statements, right? This is out there. This is history. You can learn it, but you're not taught it. You're going to have to work a little harder, and I can give you some breadcrumbs, but I can't do it all for you. You guys got to keep working at it, and help me keep working, because this isn't easy to do, and it's dangerous, because I'm on every list out there at this point. All right. So NBC News' article about corporate donations for BLM only answered a few direct donations to the Black Lives Matter organization, and the rest went to groups like the NAACP, ACLU, and Southern Poverty Law Center. Those are the groups that get people shut down, by the way. I'm on the SPLC's hate list. I can tell you. I've fought with them. Anyone who's right of center has. Christian groups have. Anyone has who basically... And it's interesting. The group of Southern Poverty Law Center spends all their time outside the South, it seems, attacking things that have nothing to do with the black issues out there. Groups like the Ford Foundation, Borealis Philanthropy, and Democracy Alliance tend to establish large funds that are distributed to many smaller organizations, chapters, and individual activists. Not everyone who claims to be with Black Lives Matter is a certified member of the group founded by Garza, Colores, and Tometi, right? They have decentralized group structures. They have cells. This is what an insurgency looks like. New York Magazine published an approving article on June 4th telling readers how to donate money to the Black Lives Matter movement. The article listed 115 funds, organizations, and individual activists linked to BLM, and those were just the financial intakes New York felt it had adequately vetted to ensure they weren't outright scammed. The article subdivided these 115 recommended donation recipients based on how they would pledge to use the money they are given, whether that's to post bail bonds for demonstrators arrested at protests, to purchase protective equipment for protesters on the front lines. So when you see them coming with whole riot gear, that's where they got it from. Those face shields were not designed to keep COVID out. They were designed to keep bullets out. To invest in rebuilding black communities where protests have occurred, or to invest in community enrichment programs for black and brown youth. In the course of a very approving June 6th piece about the growth of bail funds, The Atlantic let slip a little hint about the difficulty of tracing these tens of millions of dollars in donations. Whether celebrities or anyone for that matter who donate to a bail fund believe that the system needs a total overhaul or not is irrelevant. Their money equips activists and organizers to do work that tangibly improves the lives of people whom the police often target, right? So what happened was the money, no one knows where it went to. There was no restrictions on it. And what are we seeing? We literally saw the corporations fund the revolution against the state. Why? Because they wanted to change the state. It's like Archimedes said, give me a big enough lever and I'll move the world. In other words, money is fluid and fungible, and donors often end up financing agendas they might not fully agree with when they give money to a slogan. The value of nearly ubiquitous corporate promotion of the Black Lives Matter name over the past week is incalculable. There is nothing that kind of full spectrum, all but inescapable advertising across television, print media, and the internet could be compared to. The full BLM agenda, from the earliest days of the BLM movement, as the 2016 pieces cited above indicate, critics have noticed that it has a very wide-ranging agenda that reaches far beyond police issues and sometimes working against black lives. At the time of this writing, the top agenda item on the BLM webpage is defund the police, a position only a very small minority of Americans support, including a very small share of black Americans. But you know who did support it? The Open Society Foundation. And why? Because if you don't have police, nature abhors a vacuum, and you get to make your own, because people beg, please let us have a police force. Okay, we can't trust these things to be handled locally. We're going to have a federal police force, like you have in most places that follows federal orders. This is what's coming. The FBI will be expanded. We will have racial justice. We will have criminal justice. And what happens is we will have selective enforcement. You might have noticed that that's already happening, right? And what we want as Americans, what most Americans want, is very simple. They want equal justice under the law, regardless of race or anything else. Let the punishment fit the crime. But we don't have that. I mean, the whole movement towards hate crime, in honesty, was an effort to do that. It was to habituate you to the idea that some people are always innocent, some people are always guilty, and shut up or you're a bigot. And we've accepted that. And even you watch right-wing, let me go on a little rant for 1 second, a little mini rant. You watch right-wing media, what they always do is they find a black person to say the stuff that people want to say and are scared to say because they don't want to be called a racist. The bottom line is this: you should say what you think is true, and you should be able to say that, whether you're white, black, or anything. And I hold no issue against someone like a Ben Carson or a Michelle Malkin, who says things that are, unpopular, who are minorities. But if you're of the majority, you should be able to say that too. Facts are facts, truth is truth, and until we get to the point where we can agree on the same facts, all we can do is fight. And why do we have people who are in these movements supporting things that are demonstrably false? Because they want you to get used to the idea of living in disbelief. This is what happens when there's a communist takeover, okay? And they know that. They know that. Black Lives Matter has a lengthy what we believe statement on its website that begins with highly contentious and politicized assertions such as expressing rage at the death of Trayvon Martin and the subsequent acquittal of his killer, George Zimmerman, and moving along to justice for Mike Brown and all of those who have been torn apart by state-sanctioned violence and anti-black racism. Further down the page, the official BLM agenda wanders into support for transgenderism, a vow to dismantle cisgender privilege, and some very heavy-duty plans for destroying and rebuilding American society. And this is straight from their website, so we're reading here. We make our spaces family-friendly and enable parents to fully participate with their children. We dismantle the patriarchal practice that requires mothers to work double shifts so that they can mother in private even as they participate in public justice work. So they're against fathers. We disrupt the Western's prescribed nuclear family structure requirement by supporting each other as extended families and villages that collectively care for one another, especially our children, to the degree that mothers, parents, and children are comfortable. Once again, you take the father away because you want to have the end of a family where there is a single defender. In this case, the state is your family. And you might remember, who said it takes a village to raise children? Oh, wait, that was Hillary Clinton, right? So this is nothing new, and this is not a black thing, honestly. This is a communist thing. What do? They destroy authority. They destroy the family, they destroy the legitimate government, and they destroy history, and they will also destroy the church. And who are they targeting? Well, you tell me. We foster a queer-affirming network. When we gather, we do so with the intention of freeing ourselves from the tight grip of heteronormative thinking, or rather the belief that all in the world are heterosexual unless he or she or they disclose otherwise. And they have emphasis all over the place. In Boston, a BLM chapter is asking that $15 million in American taxpayer money be spent on providing summer jobs to not black Americans, but illegal aliens. Study after study has revealed that every 10% increase in the immigrant share of an occupation reduces the income of black American men by roughly 5%. That's actually true, by the way. By doing business with companies that support BLM, you might be inadvertently funding its destructive and coercive policy agenda. Once upon a time, even Democrats understood how radical that agenda was, as a leaked memo from 2015 revealed Democratic Party leadership warning staffers and politicians to keep their distance from the movement. Hashtag confusion. As mentioned above, many people think Black Lives Matter is a slogan, an ideal, a grassroots movement, not a political organization with 8 figures of funding and a hardcore left-wing policy agenda. This is a very old game practiced both by amateurs and political professionals. Every bill that passes through Congress is given a name that suggests only the most heartless villain could possibly oppose it. Many organizations on both the left and right claim to speak for sympathetic constituencies and carefully cultivate an image of being much less wealthy and powerful than they actually are. And by the way, that is absolutely true. I mean, the dystopic names of things is a universal political practice. We all do, by the way. By the way, Free Atlantic Radio is a wonderful name. I think we did a good job with that one. Hopefully we did. But we actually believe what we say. We want to be a free nation from this insanity, right? For all people who are in our region. In the case of Black Lives Matter, the movement's slogan is effectively becoming the definition of anti-racism, which means all disagreement and doubt are racist by definition. This can be seen in the white-hot rage at anyone who dares to say all lives matter, for example. A phrase is inherently benevolent and obviously true as Black Lives Matter, but the all formulation has been redefined as a vile curse and unforgivable assault on the purity of Black Lives Matter. That's a very large ideological umbrella, and plenty of other left-wing groups are jockeying for space underneath, and some of them highly toxic. The Jerusalem Post on Sunday worried about anti-Semitic and anti-Israel forces climbing aboard the BLM train, making an effort to hijack the civil rights discourse and portray Israel as a settler state linked to white supremacy. Have you ever noticed, I'm just going to say this because it has to be said, have you ever noticed that the thing media cares about, no matter what source it is more than any other, is that nothing can ever be questioning of Israel, Zionism, or anything that Jews do individually or corporately? And I'm just saying, it would be nice if the majority had those same protections, or any other group had those same protections. But have you ever noticed that, there's just something you just can never criticize there, and they always go there? They never talk about the various different people of any other group. You pick white, black, brown, any other, yellow, any of these groups, red, any of them, and all that, but they always go, well, the danger is they might say something bad about Israel. I mean, there's more to life than what happens over there, and it'd be nice to have an American media that gave as much a damn about America as it does that country. And I'll just say, but we don't, and you need to figure out why. And, you'll get in a lot of trouble for figuring it out, but you need to figure it out. Anyway, that hostility is clear when voices such as Mark Lamont Hill retweet a Ben & Jerry's tweet supporting the protest with the comment, "We are dealing with justice and illegal settlements, too or nah." The Jerusalem Post noted, neatly bringing together the issues of unreflective corporate support for BLM and the effort to hook other ideologies to its runaway populist locomotive. More humorously, Yahoo News on Sunday found all sorts of internet influencers trying to hitch their wagons to BLM only to be rebuffed by activists furious at them for trivializing the movement or hijacking its themes for selfish purposes. So look at Portland as the perfect example. White progressive woke kids who are going crazy. Or literally the mayor of San Francisco, London Breed, says white people need to stop hijacking Black Lives Matter. Really did happen. The line between welcome support and unexpected exploitation of the movement is blurry. Vegan restaurants are praised for donating money to BLM, for example, while a vegan influencer who endorsed BLM because it's fighting the same fight as crusaders against cruelty to animals was forcibly told to keep her deep thoughts to herself. So what are these people understanding? They understand, all of these leftist social organizers understand this is a mean to its end, and the means is communism. And there are plenty of leftists who don't support communism, but there are too many who do, and it's going to lead to really bad outcomes. White social media celebrities are taking some heat for trying to insert themselves into the BLM movement, often in ways that trivialize the issues and make the protests seem like giant black parties. Let's see, and they have an example of different tweets here. We'll skip over this. BLM itself feels that some of this performative activism dilutes its message and detracts from its policy agenda. For example, the group expressed annoyance with D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser allowing Black Lives Matter to be printed in giant letters on the street in front of the White House because it was a distraction from our demands to decrease the police budget and invest in the community. Bowser has consistently been on the wrong side of BLM D.C. history. This is to appease white liberals while ignoring our demands. Black Lives Matter means defund the police, BLM says. And this is a real tension, by the way, and this is something you need to be aware about because this is going to play a big role in the future. The activists in the street believe that they're going to get their revolution, and some of their biggest funders understand that. A lot of other people believe there are means to an end to win an election. And who's going to win out? Well, the activists in the street will, because they have lost the ability at the Democratic National Committee or whoever's controlling these people to shut them off. These people have money, they taste victory, and they're going to roll with it. And they're going to keep burning the cities down, just like happened in 68 and 72 to the point where Trump wins. And that's when things are going to get interesting, because at that point, they're going to become convinced that this is a horrible, racist, awful country, where in fact most Americans voting for Donald Trump will do so because of Joe Biden's deafening silence from his basement about what's happening. And I will say, if BLM had not broken out, Joe Biden probably would have won in a landslide. But this changed everything. And mind you, this is 2020. We may be talking about something totally different by next month, and it wouldn't surprise me if we are. I think a war might be in the offing. But this is where we're at in this, and that ultimately the radicals have taken to the streets. And so they're going to win from the streets, or they're going to get purged from the streets. But that's where we're at now, or they could break the thing apart. And you need to be aware of that. This is one of the things we do in this program, is we give you situational awareness. These people are not going home. They're well funded. They're completely protected. And there's not the will in the government at any level to stop them. They have allies in certain states and cities that are enabling them. The courts are not going to uphold the laws. The police are not going to protect you. They're going to prosecute you for protecting yourself. And eventually, if I can make a prediction, what will happen is people will form their own citizen brigades, and they will end up having to fight the police if the police don't join them. I suspect in most sane places they will, in a couple places they will not, but this is literally where this is going, and this is the same thing that happened. Go read about the history of the Freikorps in Germany or the Red Guards in China. You can learn about these things. There is nothing new under the sun. All right. So let's continue. What does Black Lives Matter really mean? What agenda are people supporting with their black boxes, tweets, Facebook posts, and financial donations? In this turbulent moment, the movement is having trouble even defining what defund the police really means. Perhaps sensing the position is so unpopular, it must be hastily redefined as reform the police. The details come later. What have we seen? The exact opposite of that. Seattle's defunding, Oregon's, Portland, New York City, and that's going to be very unpopular there. Very unpopular because New York remembers how those officers were there and keeping them safe during 9/11 and other various terrorist attacks. Police are popular in New York City, absent certain radical neighborhoods. Although maybe New York has changed, but I remember police were very popular there last time I visited. Minneapolis, Milwaukee, all these sort of things, and we're going to see. And what's going to happen is they can wreck the cities. They don't mind wrecking them because they become training camps. In the same way that universities wreck the minds of our young kids, where they're taught things that are demonstrably false and they're sent out in the world to be proselytizers, now the cities have become recruitment camps. You want to know where your Hezbollah camp is, it's going to be in Minneapolis. Unless you think I'm being too hyperbolic in this, let me remind you of something. Antifa has been sending people to train over in Syria, and the same people who are funding those movements internationally are also funding this. So these things are all connected in a worldwide global network to go ahead and push for communist ideas that preceded and continued past the Soviet Union, heavily funded by the Chinese Communist Party, supported by banks worldwide. And why would it be? Why would it be that on one hand we are taught, especially if you were of a certain age group like I am, or older, that communism was on one side and capitalism was on the other? Well, the reason why was because they realized that state monopolies and corporate monopolies could work much more neatly with one another. So all of these people are against you and your sovereignty and against the antiquated idea that you might actually have rights and liberties, and that they are going to go out there and destroy them, and they're going to go ahead and make you destroy yourself. So when they demoralize you with the coronavirus, when they destroy your businesses, when they put you on a stipend and say you should be grateful you get to survive at all, and if you're not silent, you won't get your check. If you don't do the vaccine, you won't get your check. If you say something politically offensive, you won't get your check. This is the future that's coming into being, and Black Lives Matter is the perfect beat group for it. Just like happened in Iran, where they had street gangs became the militias of what was being used there, or the Mujahideen became the Taliban. This is something that's regularly done. It actually comes from the Islam world, but it came through communism. And if you trace the Muslim Brotherhood, where did they learn that from? They learned that from the Nazis. Where they learned it from? Mussolini, who was a fascist, and Mussolini before that ran a thing called Avanti. He was a socialist. So it goes back to Marxian thinking. And if you go further, you can even go back to Satanism. But we don't have enough time for me to lay out the whole history of how sordid, corrupt, and discordant the spirit of iniquity really is. Why am I going into this level of detail for you? I'm letting you see what you should expect. And if you understand your history, if you understand your past, you can predict your future. And that's why they lie to you about it. That's what the 1619 Project, all these other things are really about when it comes down to it. This is the problem we have. So, when they say they're talking about defund the police, some BLM leaders insist they're primarily interested in sensible community policing reforms, while others think New York Governor Andrew Cuomo doesn't swing far enough to the left. And you look at what Bill de Blasio has done, and I reported to you that you could actually see up front how bad it was getting in New York City, and then we reported that New York was dying. So all of these stories are being interrelated into one thread agenda where I am trying to get you to understand America as we know it is dead. Concluding, it seems remarkable that a group with so little discipline, so much confusion over its agenda, and so much money at its disposal would be allowed to effectively demand compulsory support from the entire American public, corporate, and political class without any deep media investigation of its finances, leadership, or agenda. Many of BLM's donors are signing on to a new social contract with a great deal of fine print they should read more carefully. This was written on, I want to say it was June 4th, if I'm not mistaken. So that was 3 months ago. Welcome to dystopia, right? That's where we are now. June 11th, I apologize. It was 2.5 months ago. Okay. So what have we learned since then? We've learned that they're not going home. The riots will continue. The beatings will continue until morale improves. what is this really about? What it is about is the deliberate social transformation of this country being managed from the bottom up. Why does this work? Well, if you study the Soviet Union, you know that what happened was the Soviets were workers' councils that were in cities like St. Petersburg, which became Leningrad before it became St. Petersburg again, and Moscow, the Paris Commune, pick your examples. And that ultimately, the thing they don't tell you about the history of the Soviet Union is that it received overwhelming funding from certain wealthy families in New York to the tune of what was the equivalent of billions of dollars then to go ahead and succeed, so that the Russian imperial forces, and remember, Russia had been an empire a very long time, were able to stop it because they were never able to organize themselves. And so, what am I telling you? America as you know it is dead. This is the reality of it. Go vote Trump, go vote Biden, do what you like, but be aware that this is now hanging on. It is a corpse that's still shaking, and people are crying and mourning over it. But that you need to be walking into the new world, and most people won't tell you that. They'll tell you, well, we can go and we can revitalize it. You can't. The government doesn't have the will to do it. The financial class supports this because they think they can get a better deal at the other side of it. The military doesn't want to touch it because they know, A, it would tear themselves apart, and B, their leadership is corrupted. The president, even if he wanted to do something, functionally can't. And remember, he gave power over to FEMA to run this country in March. That's what happened. You can go back, I think it was March 23rd, go back and check that. And realistically, we have a spokesman-in-chief who goes out there and does the Pied Puppet Show. And keep in mind, we talk about the media being all of one voice. Trump was a part of that media for many years, so be careful what you believe. I know a lot of people want to invest hope in the man. I did once upon a time, I will admit that, and I regret that. And I don't know what's going to happen with the election. I honestly believe most people don't understand things at this level. I think they're going to look and see the violence in the streets. Absent anything else, they're going to vote for Trump as the bastard they know versus Biden as the cupcake they don't, and they're going to look at Kamala Harris behind them, see the danger that represents, and that people will really go nuts in the streets, and then you might see the predictions I've made starting with a California secession. I had an interesting conversation with some people about this, and here's the thought. If California secedes, do you want to fight to bring them back in, or do you want to walk out and do something better? Up here in the Atlantic and the Northeast, people in the Northeast are kind of a purpley region. We got blue cities and red backcountry, but things are not as acrimonious. As much as people from Boston have fun accents, we don't make too much fun of them up here, except for some people who just have crazy ideas, and that's changing. It's getting worse here, as it does everywhere, but perhaps not as quickly because the violence hasn't been brought here yet. That may change. But I think what we're reaching is the point where people are saying, well, maybe we should just do something differently. And that's why I do Free Atlantic Radio, reason, nature, grace, and loyalty, better values for a better system, because if your whole argument is nothing but identity politics, and take it from someone who knows identity politics, the evil dark side of the far right, I've been accused of that, and I know all those guys, I'll admit that, and what I will tell you is that most of them are just gathered in self-defense against this, and they're guilty for seeing the things ahead of time. There's a couple bad guys out there, just like any other group, and there's a lot of people who are just kind of stuck in an odd position defending things, but what I would suggest is if you're going to go down that path, then you're going to walk the path that happened in Bosnia, Serbia, and Croatia, where you have ethnic religious warfare and cities become siege zones. We're already getting there, and people are leaving. They're leaving like crazy, and I've reported on that. And all of this is being done deliberately. Why do I tell you that? Because ultimately, the world operates by inertia, that things don't change unless they have to change. Everything works in the dollar, and no one's going to change anything unless they have to because it costs so much. It's the same reason we drive gas cars, despite the fact new technologies could have been invented decades ago. There's too much money invested in the way the whole industry works, so if you upset it. But wars have a funny tendency. Just like they estimate human history jumped forward about 50 years during the 5 years of World War II, as we head toward the confluence of the American Civil War, the Great Global Reset, coronavirus, and the potential for a third world war. I'm not even talking about the fact that China's agitating hard in the South China Sea, and this is a part of the story. There's too many threads for me to pull together all at once, so we have to do different shows on each of them. And we'll try to do a show on China next week, by the way. It's important enough, and I haven't been covering it. I want to, but there's other threads I'm not even covering with astronomical phenomena. There's a lot going on. But suffice it to say, all of these things represent repeated body blows that are designed to just destroy, demoralize, wreck what was America. And I don't think America will hold together because there isn't an America anymore. There's not one America. There's a lot of Americas. And as we go away from America, the question I ask each and every one of you is, what can we do better? I want you to know also that there's nothing new. One of the things that I offer uniquely that a lot of people don't feel comfortable with, I know, but it's something I have to do because I genuinely believe it's the reason why I actually do the show, is there's a spiritual element to this that I want you to understand, that we are dealing with a force of wickedness, and we are dealing with, the possession of people who are not themselves, who have lost something in them. And so I'm going to read you a good word today to show that there is really nothing new. This is something that's very, very old. And this is from Genesis 19, 4 to 11. Before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, surrounded the house, both young and old, all the people from every quarter. And they called to Lot and said to him, "Where are the men that came to you tonight? Bring them out to us, so we may have relations with them." But Lot went out to them at the doorway and shut the door behind him and said, "Please, my brothers, do not act wickedly. Now behold, I have 2 daughters who have not had relations with man. Please let me bring them out to them and do to them whatever you like. Only do nothing to these men, inasmuch as they have come under the shelter of my roof." But they said, "Stand aside." Furthermore, they said, "This one came in as an alien, and already he is acting like a judge. Now we will treat you worse than them." So they pressed hard against Lot and came near to break the door. But the men reached out with their hands and so brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. They struck the men who were at the doorway with the house with blindness, both small and great, so they wearied themselves trying to find the doorway. People were fighting back in ancient antiquity, and they were threatening one another, and people tried to bargain, but you can't bargain with them. And eventually what happens is the evil gets so bad that in the case of Sodom, it ended up being destroyed by hellfire. So, or I should say brimstone. I shouldn't say hellfire. That's not technically accurate. And so why do I mention this to you? Because when people become so lost, when they become so possessed of an evil spirit towards one another, and they fail to follow the Christian message that you have to love your enemy, even if you disagree with them. And I disagree heartily with these people, but I try to talk to everyone, and I've always done that. You get to a point where all is left is destruction and hatred and chaos and antipathy, and we become animals. That is where we are. We are now animals at this point. We are not acting like human beings, save for the listeners of this show and a few people out there, but the degradation becomes faster, because what happens is if you're surrounded by animals, it ends up being a kill or be killed world, and that's going to happen. So what do you need to do now? What is my message to you? You need to go ahead and you need to make friends. You need to prepare. You need to get the hell out of the cities if you haven't already. I've been warning you for 6 months. If you had listened in February, you were listening to me. A lot of you were. You would be much safer now, but you're running out of time. When winter comes, it's going to be too late. You need to be out by November, and that might be too late, so you all need to listen to me. With that in mind, that is the sort of message I'm going to give you today. Next week, I think we're going to go ahead and we're going to look at China. We're going to look at the digital currency. And who knows, I'm going to try to pick something upbeat about how maybe we try to get through this if something awful doesn't happen that forces me to talk about it. And then we will be at that point up to Labor Day. And I suspect the riots are going to be awful. It's interesting that the government gave people enough money with these stimulus checks and unemployment that they were able to go ahead and get people out of work and destroy the businesses they had. But once they were out of work, they let the suffering persist. Why did they do that? Because an angry person is someone you can control. If you are led by your feelings, people will give you the feelings that lead you around. Be cool, be calm, be rational. Pray on what you do and think about it. Heavenly Father, I pray that a spirit of reflection comes over this country as we stand at the precipice of truly terrible times, and that people awaken, if not in all of us, then in enough of us who can survive and be wise to one another and go ahead and recognize a spirit of concord, of reconciliation is necessary, and that we must look honestly at what's happened, and that an unveiling happen for all people so they can see things as they are, not as they're said. And I pray in Jesus' name that you give the wisdom to those who have ears to listen and eyes to look, that they can see this. So that is my show for today. Thank you very much for listening to another episode of Free Atlantic Radio. Reminder, contributions can be sent to the Venmo at CVCPRV. Keep safe, be smart, get more food. Trust me on that one. When the inflation starts hitting badly, and little birdies tell me it's going to happen in September, don't know if it's true or not, but things that tend to tweet around me tend to know a thing or two. You're going to want to have more food, and you better have enough to at least make it through this winter. If you're not at 6 months, go now. Go do some shopping. Listen to some more episodes. Listen to our sister station on Free Atlantic Voices. Get a little bit of a harder edge view of things, but it'll be interesting. And I will be back with you on Monday. God bless each and every one of you.